Welcome, everyone, again. As I shared last week, this is an incredibly uniquely rare opportunity to talk about this Haftarah, because this is the rarest Haftarah of the entire cycle. It's only read about 10% of the time, and as we discussed last time, it needs the confluence of a certain number of events. Hanukkah fall on a Friday, Rosh Chodesh of Cheshvan to be 29 days, and the Moled to be on a Shabbat. It's a rarity. Most of the time, Parshat Miketz overlaps with Hanukkah, and even when you have two Shabbatot Hanukkah, even when you have two Shabbos on Hanukkah, there are two Haftorahs for Hanukkah, and so it always gets bumped by that way. But 2020 has yet another surprise in store for us in the Jewish calendrical cycle. I'll tell you the truth, it's not even going to be the most unique thing of the year, besides all the craziness. We'll jump ahead to next week, which is not a Haftorah unique piece. Next week is going to be a very unique Friday, in that next week, Friday is the 10th of Tevet, which is a fast day. Which means that we will go into Shabbos fasting. It's the only time that we do that. And it also means that on Mincha before Kabbalat Shabbat, we will actually take a Torah out, we will read, it will have its own Haftorah. So it's just, again, the peculiarity of 2020 strikes again in this last listen as we this year.
I never realized that a fast day could occur on a Friday.
It's the only one. It's the only one. Some people try to read into it the power of this fast day. It's not totally the case. Some of it has to do with the way the calendar is set. Our calendar is linked to a lunar and solar cycle. And in order to make sure the calendar works a certain way, half the year, the calendar is very fixed. The other half of the year, the calendar is very fluid, only to prevent one instance where a Asar B'Teves will fall on Shabbos. And so therefore, there's only one restriction of every day from Cheshvan all the way through Adar. So for example, Hanukkah can fall out on any day of the week except for Tuesday, and start on a Tuesday. Just the way the calendar works. There's a whole mathematical function of the calendar. It's a 19-year cycle, and there are different types of years. It's immensely intensive and thoughtful and complex, but way beyond the scope of our Haftarah conversation. So next week will be a fascinating Friday afternoon into Shabbat, and then add in all the COVID things, and 19 inches of snow tomorrow, and who knows what. So anyways, we have an incredible opportunity to talk about the Haftarah this week. Haftarah comes from the middle of the very beginning of Malachim, as we pointed out when we saw several weeks ago the story of King David's death, or the end of King David's life, and the establishment of his son Shlomo as the next king. We saw that as the beginning of Malachim. We talked about different types of transitions. We're not going to revisit that, but this is already as Shlomo is becoming king. And what we'll look at today, again, is what is the Haftarah telling us? What's the message in the Haftarah? And what are the connections latent and explicit in the Haftarah to our Parsha that kind of tie this together? And that's our frame. So our Haftarah actually begins in the middle of the story, right? We start in the middle of the verse, and just to catch us up, or in the middle of the chapter, Shlomo has this vision,
Rabbi, what page is this on in the Stone Edition?
Sorry?
What page is this Haftarah on in the Stone Edition? Do you know?
1 second.
Oh, I know. 1143.
I will take Eileen's word for it.
I believe, right?
Yeah, 1143 in the stone.
Right.
So we begin the story is right before this, Shlomo has this vision, and essentially God offers him riches, offers wisdom, offers, all these different things. And Shlomo chooses wisdom to be able to rule the people properly. And God's so impressed that God tells Shlomo he's going to grant him everything, right? And that's kind of the stage right now. Shlomo's going to have this incredible wisdom. Steve.
No, I was not raising my hand, so
okay.
but thank you. Sorry.
No, so occupational hazard when you have your hand like that.
Yeah.
So our Haftarah begins by Yikat Shlomo. Shlomo wakes up, V'hinei chalom, and behold, it was a dream. So right off the bat, as we start thinking about the connection to our parsha, right, it's very clear that this is a very similar language to what happens in the beginning of our parsha. Parsha Miketz begins with Aro's dreams, or one dream, and we're definitely in the part of the Torah where there are a lot of dreams. Yosef has lots of dreams, so even this language is very similar. And what we're going to see is that this is the famous Solomonic story of splitting the baby. I was trying to find, is anyone a Calvin and Hobbes fan here? So Calvin and Hobbes is this comic with a little boy.
Oh, yes.
Oh, Calvin and Hobbes, sure.
Yes.
Calvin and Hobbes. So there's this great cartoon of Calvin and Hobbes where Hobbes is the tiger stuffed animal that is his imaginary plaything, and they're playing with these worms and they're fighting over this worm. So his father comes out and says, if you guys don't stop fighting, I'm going to cut the worm in half. And Calvin turns back and says, awesome, I'm going to go find some more worms. And the father thinks to himself, I think Solomon was dealing with different characters in his time. I was looking for the comic. I couldn't find it this morning. But that's the famous story that we're referring to now, not about worms, obviously about children, about a child, as the Haftarah continues. And clearly this story is not just an incidental story. It comes right after God says that Shlomo is going to have this, great wisdom and capacity and knowledge, that this story is going to be an illustration of that. And even before we read the story, we'll see at the very end of the Haftarah, which kind of takes us into the next chapter, that what happens as a result of this story, Vayishma Kol Yisrael, all the peoples heard et hamishpat asher shafat hamelech, the judgment that the king judged, right? The ruling that the king said, and everyone saw, skipping to the end of this verse, ki chachma Elohim b'kirbo so mishpat, that he had this great wisdom of God, of the divine wisdom that was endowed to him, and therefore he's able to do mishpat, and they're all impressed with him about that judgment. And therefore, Vayihi Melech Shlomo Melech al Kol Yisrael, that cements his kingship, his rulership, that makes him the sovereign. Everyone is willing to accept him, and they're so impressed with his wisdom at that moment. And that's really, when we look at the story as the Navi is presenting to us, it's supposed to leave us in awe by Shlomo's response. And the question I would put in the back of our head as we think about this is, does this story really do that? So what is the story? What is the story? So if you look at, we're going back now to the beginning of Torah. Two women come Al Hamelach as a child. The two women are described in this verse as zonot, as prostitutes, as harlots. As a child, we were taught that these two women were innkeepers. Another way of potentially reading the word zonot as from the word mazon, for food. As an innkeeper, they provided food. I don't think that's the pshat at all, but that's the way you teach it to a 13-year-old and 14-year-old. We don't really want to explain that to. But it loses a little bit the power here, is that part of the wisdom right off the bat that's incredible here is that you have these two people who are often looked at as the lowest rung of society, who have this issue of, illegitimacy of the child. And, clearly this is not a legitimate child, or it doesn't seem to be. And the rabbis actually play that up shortly. We'll see the Meiri quotes a Midrash that has this crazy convoluted case on how the child is actually the brother-in-law to one of the women, the brother-in-law to one of the women, and that's part of what's going on here.
You mean stepbrother?
The that one of the women was previously married to the brother of this child. That it's like a mother, like a crazy type of case. But I was, and we'll look at that in a second. But we'll come back to this idea that really we're highlighting that this is almost like a very low level of society, vulnerable, often looked as immoral type of level. And here the king is hearing this judgment and going to pronounce judgment. They're not just going to say, go figure it out on your own, like, whatever happens, who cares? Right? Clearly the king cares. And that's an important part of the Jewish justice system that I think the Haftarah here highlights and is lost when we try to censor this to kids, obviously to make sure it's age appropriate. But as adults, when we come back to it and we look at it, and we recognize the reality of that, that is a very powerful notion about justice as well, that the Haftarah very clearly puts out as a detail here. So what happens? One says, Bia Adonai, Bia Adoni, please my master the king, Ani v'Aisha azot. We live in the same house, and we both gave birth in the same time period. Verse number 19, Bayamat ben Haish Hazot Laila Asher, that this woman's son died in the middle of the night. Asher Shachva Alav, that she laid on him, which is the commentaries play up on this as that detail. Either it's a horrible accident that happens, or maybe there's something more here we'll have to come to. And what happened in the middle of the night? She got up, she took my child, and she switched them. And so she gave me the child that was no longer alive, and she took my live child. And when I woke up in the morning, I realized that this lo haya b'ni asher yaladti. This is not the child I gave birth to. Verse 21. And the other woman says, no, my child's the live child, your child's the dead child. And that's not the case. And they both spoke before the king. So what does the king say? Vayomer Melech, the king says, Zot omer ze b'ni achai v'ze ubincha hamet. Yours ubenech hamet. Yours is the one that's alive, and mine's the live one. You're saying yours is the dead one, and mine's the live one, right? One of the fascinating things here, and we actually learn a halacha from this. The first thing the king does is repeats their claims. So one of the first things that we actually learn as a Jewish judge is a requirement that the judge needs to repeat back to both parties what their claims are. So it's clear that they have an understanding what that is. Obviously, so many Jewish halachot, it's not just for judges. Right? When we're listening to people, the power of being able to formulate back to them what they said, first of all, in terms of validating what they said, but also making sure that we really concretize what they said, that we're really listening, that we can repeat back to them, that we're not just thinking about our response, but we're going to that deep level of deep listening, right? The king is already showing that wisdom right over here of repeating that. You're saying this, you're saying that. And then he goes into solving, as opposed to, assuming. I was recently at a meeting where we started the meeting with someone saying, all right, we all agree on the problem, let's talk about the solution. And then you hear 15 different solutions. And I actually said at the meeting, all right, 1 second, let's all see, what do we think the problem we all are solving that we all agree to? And it was fascinating to hear every person who gave a different solution was attacking a different problem, right? This idea of being able to really listen and then be able to repeat and concretize that we are listening, that we're validating, that we're understanding, and then moving forward, it perhaps is already the first sign of true wisdom that the people are going to walk away from this moment and say, oh, look, the king is a brilliant king and a truly wise leader. So what happens, as the famous story goes, the king says, bring me a sword, and they bring a sword before the king. And the king said, let's cut the child in half, and half goes to one, half goes to the other. Vatomer Haisha, and the woman responded, Asher B'na Hachai, that is the mother of the live child. So already the pasuk, the verse, is no longer neutral, right? We know who the right one and who the wrong one is, right? We just identified who this is. And what do we say? Because her mercy has been arisen for her child. Said, no, please, the king shouldn't do that. Give the live child to the other, and don't kill her. Don't kill him. The Zot Omer, and the other one, who is the false mother in this case, Gam li, gam lach, lo yeh, right? Both our children should be should be dead. No one's going to get this. That should be, we'll both split this child. So what happens? Vayan HaMelech, the king famously says, give the child to the woman who said whatever, and don't put her to death. He imo. She is his mother, right? And that's the end of this famous story. So the question, there are a number of questions to approach this with. But the first is, and just to conclude, as we started with, all of the people heard this ruling, and they're so impressed with the king, this Solomonic justice, right? And all of a sudden, the king's knowledge and popularity, rose up across the question we have to ask ourselves as we approach this story is, how does this story convey his great wisdom? Right? Is this really such incredible wisdom that is on this divine level that no one can think of? I mean, it's kind of hard because we all grew up hearing the story. So now when you hear the story, right, kind of think like, how hard is it to think about that? But it's an important question to ask, right? He essentially puts a test in front of them, and he wants to understand what's going on, and therefore he's able to kind of surmise what's happening here. So
the only way to answer that is if some theoretical way we could present the same question to a different king or a different judge, see how they would react.
Right. We could go in the street, ask someone, have you ever heard of the Bible? If they tell you no, tell them this case and ask them what they would do. Right. So but what do we think? Is this such brilliant wisdom? So this is what the commentaries struggle with. We'll talk about some of them, but what do we think?
I think it was brilliant wisdom because he was taking a chance. There's a possibility, very small possibility, but there was that possibility that if the king said it, even the real mother, although she would be so terribly distraught and disheartened, might not say something against his edict or whatever. So he was taking a bit of a chance, and he was hoping for this reaction, obviously, which is brilliant if you think about it.
It seems to me that the answer that he came up with, the solution that he came up with, is obvious only because we know what the answer is. But
Right.
I think many other people would have tried to further interrogate the claimants, to try to see, is it possible somebody was passing by in the middle of the night, and to go through a whole lengthy process before coming to some conclusion. And he was able to immediately grasp what was going on.
So you're taken by the story.
Rabbi, the story itself, just even stepping back a little bit, it almost has the earmarks of like an allegory rather than a story, because I can understand why these women are even in front of the king, because there are no witnesses and therefore there's nothing a Beit Din could do. But the response of the woman who stole the baby is just very, very strange. Here the other mother's giving it to her and she's saying, no, kill it. It's really strange. Okay, so it seems to me that suggests that there's something else in this story that's conveying the wisdom rather than the actual incident with the sword.
Right. So I want to get back to this question. I want to also ask the next question. What is it that tells him exactly which is which? So some of the commentaries say, well, that's obvious, the mother who gives it up. Others say what Lee just said. What convinced the king was the response of the other mother, who said, cut the baby in half, meaning, and this is a debate between the Radak and some others. The Radak is the 12th century David Kimchi, who notes that what the king was looking for was the rachamim, the rachmanus, the mercy of the mother. Others, and I think it's Ibn Ezra, who notes actually the murderous or the violent intent of the other woman that the king is pouncing on, and you can kind of read both into the story. Obviously, it's very clear that it's the rachamim, the rachmanus, the mercy of the mother, because the verse says that explicitly. But if you look at some of the language here, even as they're describing the baby, right? One says, my child is alive and your child is not. The other says, your child is dead and my child is alive, right? Which are they putting first? Are they putting first the death or the life, even though they were describing the same scenario, right? They're both saying that their child's alive and the other child's dead, but one says, your child is dead and my child's alive, and the other is saying, my child's alive, your child's dead. And similar to what Lee said, that they're picking up on those nuances. So the question is, what is the king using as the measure here to know? And how does that show great wisdom? So I want to share with you the approach of the Abarbanel, who notes, who quotes a lot of these opinions. The Abarbanel is a 15th century commentator who is an excellent commentator who fell a little bit out of style because of his very long writing. Right, a set of Abarbanel could fill an entire bookshelf. Right, not exactly the way these are. You read some of these commentaries, and some of them are actually drashot, actually sermons that were given by rabbis at the time. You have to assume that there was the sermon they gave on Shabbat, and then the rest that they rewrote afterwards. Because some of these are like 30-page essays. And I think of what the shul used to be like if I spoke for 13 minutes instead of 12 minutes. I can't imagine listening to a 4-hour drasha from the Ran or from Rabbi Yitzchak Arama in the 1400s, where he has 30 pages. So I imagine they were written into essay form afterwards. He makes it.
He had to serve quite a kiddush after that.
Yeah, seriously. And by the way, for the case of Yitzchak Arama, it was the second sermon you have to hear, because Yitzchak Arama's sermons, the Kedah Yitzchak, who we often quote, he's living in the 1400s, the late 1400s. He's expelled during the Spanish Inquisition and then moves further. But right before that, he's living in Rome, and he is writing, or he's actually living in northern Italy, and he's writing sermons. Part of the papal decree was that people would have to listen to a sermon on Shabbat by a priest, telling them all the things they were doing terrible. And Rabbi Yitzchak Arama would give the rebuttal to that in the afternoon. And you actually have in Rome, in the Jewish quarter, there's a shul that is decorated with the most weird verses from all the prophets, saying things like "don't enter," but in like very clever ways. And it's actually the shul that was built by the church to force all the Jews to come in Shabbos morning. You had to go to listen to this sermon about why Judaism was wrong, Christianity was right. It was right in the Jewish quarter. And Rabbi Yitzchak Arama in northern Italy would write and speak every Shabbos afternoon as a rebuttal to the sermon they heard in the morning. So this is the second sermon they ever heard. So anyways, what does the Abarbanel say? The Abarbanel notes, kind of tying these two ideas together, quoting some of the opinions that we've quoted, and he writes, I'm just gonna share the screen. I couldn't find it on Sefaria, so I have it from some source sheet. So he talked over here about what was the real V'hu Shlomo Isig that he got the truth of what happened, Koden Hanisayon, before the experience, before the moment, before the Bechina Hazot, before he was able to tell that he knew what the answer was. And the whole experience was to confirm to the people in his court that he was right. Meaning essentially what the Abarbanel notes is that he could tell based on their face and the way they were describing it. And what happened? He revealed it to the Yoshvim Lefanav Ha'inyan, and he said, I'm going to explain to you which is the right answer, and then I'm going to prove it to you through a test. That part of the wisdom of Shlomo here wasn't that he got this right, but that he knew from the outset what was the answer. And then he did this ruse to show everyone, because it's one thing for me to know the answer if you don't know the answer, right? Who knows? Which parenthetically is just one more connection to our parsha, right? What is the Midrash explain about the parsha? And even though this is not the pshat, right? The Midrash understands this, and the rabbis who are connecting the Haftarah and the parsha together are thinking about the Midrash as well. The Haftarah, the Midrash tells us that Paro is listening to these these interpretations, and he has a inkling of what the right interpretation is, right? Just like the two dreams that we read in last week's parsha, that they each dreamt each other's interpretation. So they each knew that Yosef was right automatically, because they knew in that they were revealed that interpretation as well. So Paro had some inkling, or really knew what the right answer was as well. And by Yosef describing it to him and then being able to tell him what to do, Paro was able to not just validate that Yosef knew what he was talking about, but then follow his advice and how to address that. So the same thing here. Shlomo is proving his wisdom, not by telling them not by using this ruse to show them that he can figure it out, but by telling them a priori and bringing everyone along so that they will know that he's so smart, right? That shows some real wisdom. And that's what the Abarbanel describes here, which is obviously a great connection to our Haftarah. And that Shlomo understands over here that there's this, and that's what proves Shlomo's wisdom. He's basically able to tell everyone before, this is what the answer is going to be, and let me tell you how we're going to get there. And either by the mercy of the mother, or the cruelty of the other woman, or of the whatever the response is of the ruse to the sword, Shlomo is able to show and reveal to everyone in their court not just that he knows what the answer is, but everyone knows in their heart that Shlomo's also that's also the answer. Which unfortunately, that's a perfect parallel to today, right? It's one thing for you to think you know the facts, but to convince other people that the facts that you say are true are really true, that's a whole other issue that we're facing in our world. Shlomo was able to do both. Shlomo was able to tell you this is what the answer is, and then convince everyone that what he's saying is really true, right? That's not fake news, right? That's the wisdom, the brilliance of Shlomo, at least according to the Abarbanel. One of the fascinating offshoots of this, which if we were probing Talmudic implications of these conversations, is how much do we take in assumptions into adjudicating rules, adjudicating court cases. There's a whole tractate, in a whole section in the Tractate of Sanhedrin about what do we do in Umdana with an assumption of the judge, right? Can you make a judgment based on an assumption? But there's no proof. I think as someone pointed out, either was it Lee, that there were no witnesses and there's no testimony given and there was no evidence collected, right? So this is clearly Shlomo's intuition and knowledge, and then a case where he's able to prove it based on psychology, but that's not cold hard facts. So how does that work? So the Talmud actually struggles with that, and what does that mean for an umdana? For an umdana means an assumption. So what type of assumption is Shlomo providing here? Can I really judge something based on assumption? The case in the Talmud gives is, let's say I have a wild animal running around in a place. And then I find shortly afterwards some livestock that has been killed by seemingly a wild animal. Can I assume that the example in the case in the Talmud is a crazy donkey or camel? That was the cases in the Talmud. But let's say I know you're a crazy camel that was crazed, just ran by here, and now I see 3 sheep were mauled. Can I assume that your camel did the damage and therefore fine you or require you to pay restitution to the owners of these sheep, of this cattle? That's an assumption, right? No one has evidence that this happened, unless there's CSI going to match the teeth marks of your camel to those bite marks, right? We don't have real evidence. So what role does that play in the judicial system? So our Haftarah touches on that topic. But it's just an interesting interplay between that as well, and the role the king plays in that. So I want to take one step back. Then we'll conclude. So we've talked so far about our Haftarah, how it's unique. We talked about the story, and how really the story is, as Lee pointed out, it's an allegory. It's supposed to show us a symbol of Solomon's great wisdom that was promised to him and awarded to him in the last chapter, the beginning of this chapter, and propels him forward to be this uniting king and this wise king for the entire people. The question we ask ourselves is, how does this show this great wisdom? So either we can be very taken by his ability to examine the facts and develop a ruse to make sure to see how to suss out the details, or develop the right test to check that. That could be one brilliance that happens here. And either that's his wisdom to elicit the mercy of one mother, or it's his wisdom to parse in the words the violence of the other individual. Or, as the Barbanel points out, he was able to size up the situation from the beginning. The whole ruse was just to be able to convince everyone else that he knew what he was talking about. And we've connected this now to our Haftarah, to our Parsha, in a couple of different ways. One was the dreams, although it kind of unfolds in a very different way. Paro wakes up perturbed by his dream, not knowing really what to do. It brings all of his advisors to try to suss out what the dream really means. Whereas in our Parsha, our Haftarah, it's the parallel opposite, right? In that Shlomo wakes up, he clearly understands what the dream means. He goes and celebrates with all the people in Yerushalayim after he's had this dream. The people can celebrate and bask in the wisdom that the dream has provided to him. So it's kind of the opposite. The idea, the decision here to motive that's one part. The other really interesting connection, which I've seen noted by some people, is the connection between the role of a parent and the ability to make a decision that's best for the child at the expense of what the parent wants, which obviously is the case here. The mother is making a decision. She'd rather the child live than live with her, right? Better the child be alive and her be able to see her son. And then if you think to our Parsha, we have another story like that, as ultimately the defining moment in our Parsha, when Yaakov decides to allow Binyamin to go down to Egypt with Yehuda, even though he knows that there's a chance that he might be trapped in Egypt just like Shimon. But better Binyamin be alive in Egypt than everyone perish because of famine in Israel. And so some want to tease out that connection as well. It's not as tight as some of the other connections we've seen. The other note I want to bring up, we talked about recognizing, the needs of all society, and really Shlomo's wisdom about being able to both hear and parrot back, be able to really internalize what's being said, but recognizing that the people staying before him are what's considered the lowest rung of society, people who you barely give the time of day to, is similar to Yosef as well, where Yosef ultimately institutes a plan to make sure that no one goes hungry, that everyone has food in Egypt. And that notion of engaging not just with Paro's inner circle, but protecting all of Egypt seems to be a connection as well. It's a rare opportunity for us to study this Parsha. I think the last time was in 2013, and before that, I think it was in the 80s. So the next one's going to be 2023, I believe. So sometimes it's short, sometimes it's not so far, and then I think afterwards it's like 2039 or something like that. So we're still studying Haftarah at that point. We'll get a new look at this story as well. So we'll any questions?
We should all live and be well till then.
Yeah, exactly.
The essay that I'm reading here, Rabbi, it says that Shlomo had a second name, Yedidyah. Is that commonly acknowledged, that he was the same as Yedidyah, or that Yedidyah was a different king?
I don't think Yedidyah was a king at all. Is Shlomo, where is this name acknowledged? I'll honestly tell you, I'm not 100% sure, but nothing like an easy search of
That's okay. You don't have to take the time now. I just...
Yedidyah, no, so Yedidyah is... So is another name given to Shlomo all the way back in Shmuel. In Shmuel 12:25.
Yes, Shmuel that. I guess it emphasizes his knowledge Although there's no ayin, right?
What is Yedidya means beloved of God.
Beloved. It's not knowledge. Beloved, as opposed to Shlomo, which emphasizes peace. Huh.
But it's also not. He is not referred to that here. So
Yeah.
I think they might be commenting on his knowledge, but that's a different derivation.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to the calendar for a minute,
Yeah.
is it unusual to have 3 months in a row, 1 day Rosh Chodesh? Because I happen to notice that next month,
Shavat is always 1
is
day.
also 1 day.
Is it?
Shavat, I think, is always 1 day.
I know, but to have 3 in a row.
So that's where the calendar sort of, the fixedness of the calendar switches, because Cheshvan is where it changes.
Did we have 1 day Cheshvan or 2?
We had 1 day of Kislev. We had 2 days of Cheshvan. And then we have 1 day of Tevet and 1 day of Shvat. That's where the fixedness of the calendar varies, because in the other parts of the calendar it just rotates. Meaning in half the year, from after Adar through Cheshvan, the calendar is fixed, right? That's why Rosh Hashanah can only fall out in 4 days. And that's what that prevents Yom Kippur from falling out on Friday, falling out on Sunday, which would be untenable. And Hoshana Rabbah from falling out on Shabbos. And those are the 3 things that we're worried, and therefore we block 3 days on the calendar that would prevent. Therefore, Rosh Hashanah can only fall out on 4 different days, because if it falls out on those other 3 days, Yom Kippur would fall on Shabbos, Yom Kippur fall on Sunday, Hoshana Rabbah fall on Shabbos. Right? Those are the 3 restrictions on the calendar half the year. The other half of the year, the only restriction we have is we don't have a Asar B'Teves fall out on Shabbos. So therefore, it's only 1 day, and therefore the rest of the calendar can kind of adjust accordingly. But yeah, it's. I mean, I don't know how rare it is. I will tell you, there's an excellent Facebook person. It's not a real person though. It's called Hebrew Calendar Cool Facts. And they run a lot of these scenarios, like what are the chances that Hanukkah falls out on Thanksgiving, and and it's a full moon. It happened once in X whatever. It's very cleverly done. I'm sure as Rosh Chodesh approaches, they'll have something about when was the last time we had 3 one-day Rosh Chodeshes in a row.
Yeah, just seem curious.